In the spring of 1950, the People's Liberation Army Air Force had fewer than 100 serviceable aircraft, most of them donated by Moscow or captured from a defeated enemy. The pilots who flew them had learned their trade in a matter of months. The mechanics keeping those machines in the air were working from manuals they barely understood. Within a year, those same pilots were in combat over Korea, trading blows with the most advanced fighter jets America could put in the sky. What followed over the next 7 decades was not a gradual evolution. It was a forced march, driven by necessity, interrupted by political catastrophe, and ultimately completed through every method available: copying, buying, stealing, and finally building from scratch. This is the complete story of every fighter jet ever flown by the Chinese Air Force. 22 types, 76 years, and a transformation that reshaped the balance of air power across the entire Indo-Pacific. Chapter 1. Born in Nihon Crisis, the MiG years, and the Korean Crucible. The PLAAF was formally established on November 11, 1949. 8 days earlier, the People's Republic itself had only just been declared. The Air Force was, in every practical sense, an afterthought to a revolution that had been fought on the ground. What China had in the air in those first months was a collection of Soviet hand-me-downs and nationalist aircraft captured during the Civil War. The MiG-15, designated J-2 in Chinese service, changed everything. Moscow supplied them directly, along with Soviet advisors and a training pipeline built for speed rather than depth. The aircraft itself was a shock to the Western world. Swept wings, a ceiling above 15,000 meters, and a climb rate that made the early American jets look slow. Armed with 137mm and two 23mm cannons, it was designed to destroy bombers, and over Korea it proved devastatingly effective against B-29 formations, forcing the Americans to abandon daylight raids almost entirely. China entered the Korean War officially in October 1950. By the time the armistice was signed in July 1953, the PLAAF had expanded from 2 aviation brigades to 28 full divisions operating 3,000 aircraft. Zhao Baotong became the first Chinese jet ace of the conflict. The J-2 remained in Chinese service until 1978, a run of nearly 3 decades that included the 1958 Taiwan Strait crisis, where PLAAF MiG-15s engaged nationalist aircraft in engagements that gave Chinese pilots their first sustained combat experience against Western-equipped opponents. The lessons of Korea pushed China toward the next generation immediately. The MiG-17 arrived as the J-4 in Soviet-built form in the early 1950s, a transitional platform that bridged the gap while Shenyang prepared for something more ambitious. On July 19, 1956, test pilot Wu Keming lifted off the runway at Shenyang in the first Chinese-built MiG-17F, designated J-5, and originally called Dongfeng 101, East Wind 101. It was China's first domestically manufactured jet fighter, assembled under Soviet license using plans, pattern aircraft, and 15 knockdown kits supplied by Moscow. 767 single-seat J-5s followed. The J-5A, a radar-equipped variant based on the MiG-17PF, added a basic all-weather intercept capability, the first time any Chinese aircraft could engage targets it could not physically see. The MiG-19 came next. Supersonic in level flight, the first production aircraft in the world to achieve it, China built its copy under the designation J-6. Over 4,000 would eventually be produced, making it the most numerously built aircraft in PLAAF history, and one of the most exported jets to the developing world. Simple, fast, and brutally reliable, The J-6 formed the numerical backbone of the PLAAF through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Chapter 2. Flying Alone. The Sino-Soviet Split and What It Cost. In 1960, the Soviet Union pulled every one of its technical advisors out of China. They took the blueprints with them, or destroyed what they could not carry. China was left in the middle of developing the MiG-21, its most capable aircraft to date, with incomplete documentation and no one to fill the gaps. The result was the J-7. It finally entered PLAAF service in January 1966, 7 years after the original MiG-21 had already been flying with Soviet forces. 7 years of delay during one of the most contested decades in Cold War aviation. The J-7 was a Mach 2 capable delta-wing fighter, lightweight and agile, but by the time it reached Chinese squadrons, it was already a generation behind what American and Soviet pilots were flying. Over 2,400 airframes were eventually produced across all variants, and China kept exporting the design all the way to 2013, when Bangladesh received the final batch. That same political chaos that delayed the J-7 very nearly destroyed the J-8 program entirely. China's first completely indigenous jet fighter design, the J-8 was conceived in 1964 as a twin-engine high-altitude interceptor, larger and faster than anything in the existing inventory. Development stretched across the Cultural Revolution, a decade in which engineers were persecuted, programs were halted, and institutional knowledge was systematically destroyed. The J-8 did not make its first flight until July 5, 1969, 5 years behind its original schedule. What emerged was a Mach 2.2 capable interceptor with twin engines fed by lateral intakes, optimized for the altitude bands where Chinese radar coverage was strongest and where incoming threats were most expected. But without a modern radar, it was limited to visual range engagements, a serious constraint for an aircraft that had no other way to find its targets. That constraint drove the J-8 too. The redesigned variant moved the air intakes to the sides of the fuselage, freeing the nose for a proper fire control radar. It first flew in 1984. Approximately 300 were built. For the first time, a Chinese fighter could engage targets beyond visual range, a capability that every Western fourth-generation aircraft had carried for a decade already. Alongside the fighter programs, China needed something that could hit targets on the ground with precision. The answer was the Q-5 Fantan, a ground attack derivative of the J-6 with a completely redesigned forward fuselage, an internal weapons bay, and twin lateral intakes replacing the nose intake of its parent design. It first flew in June 1965. Approximately 1,200 were eventually built. Unglamorous, numerous, and essential, it was the PLAAF's primary strike aircraft through 2 decades of Cold War tension. Chapter 3. Looking West. The Brief Window and What China Learned. The late 1970s and early 1980s opened a narrow window of Western technology access that China moved quickly to exploit. A 1979 agreement with France allowed the purchase of Snecma turbofan engines and related technology. Chinese engineers studied them intensively, not to fly them, but to understand what Chinese power plant development was still missing. The Reagan administration went further. The Peace Pearl program, launched in the early 1980s, approved the sale of American avionics technology and manufacturing equipment to China. The goal was a modernized J-8 with Western radar and cockpit systems. The program was canceled abruptly after June 1989. China kept the knowledge it had already absorbed. Britain's Rolls-Royce Spey turbofan engines had arrived even earlier, acquired in the early 1970s through commercial channels before the full opening of Western Chinese relations. China used that engine as the basis for the J-7, a twin-engine supersonic fighter bomber designed to give the PLAAF and naval aviation a genuine precision strike capability. Development was tortured. The program stretched across nearly 2 decades. The J-7A production variant did not reach operational units until the early 2000s. But when it did, it carried anti-ship missiles and precision-guided munitions that no previous Chinese aircraft could deliver. It was the first Chinese aircraft designed from the outset for the strike role rather than adapted to it. That engine, the Spey, buried inside a Chinese airframe, was itself a quiet admission of how far Chinese power plant technology still had to travel. That gap would haunt every major program for the next 30 years. Chapter 4. The Flanker Deal. Russia sells what China cannot yet build. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. China moved within a year. In 1992, the PLAAF signed a contract for 24 Sukhoi Su-27Sk Flanker B aircraft at an estimated cost of $1 billion. It was the most significant single acquisition in the Air Force's history, the first time China had purchased a genuine fourth-generation air superiority fighter capable of matching Western designs on roughly equal terms. The Su-27 was extraordinary by comparison with anything in Chinese service. Twin Saturn AL-31F turbofans producing over 12,000 kilograms of thrust each. A maximum speed of Mach 2.35. A combat radius exceeding 1,500 kilometers. The N001 radar capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously. And the R-27 missile family for beyond visual range engagements. Against the J-7S and J-8S that formed the bulk of the PLAAF's inventory, the Su-27 was not an upgrade. It was a different category of aircraft entirely. The license production agreement followed in 1996. Shenyang would build 200 copies designated J-11, using Russian-supplied components and Russian engines. China suspended the contract after completing 105 aircraft and began building the rest with domestic components. Moscow protested. Beijing proceeded. The J-11B, which entered service around 2006, replaced the Russian power plant with the Chinese WS-10 turbofan and the Russian avionics with Chinese systems. It was reverse engineering at industrial scale, exactly the playbook Moscow had written in the 1940s when it copied the American B-29. More flankers followed. Between 2000 and 2004, China acquired 76 Su-30 MKK and 24 Su-30 Mk2 aircraft, twin-seat strike variants with improved avionics and a genuine multi-role capability that the original Su-27 had never been designed for. The Su-30 MKK became the PLAAF's long-range precision strike platform for the first decade of the 21st century. The aircraft that could actually threaten surface targets at range with guided weapons. China's final Russian purchase came in 2015. 24 Su-35S aircraft, fully delivered by 2019. The stated motivation, at least partly, was the Saturn AL-41F1S engine with its three-dimensional thrust vectoring nozzle. China wanted to study that technology for its own next-generation power plant programs. As of 2025, the PLAAF and Chinese naval aviation operate approximately 319 flanker family aircraft across all variants, more than any country outside Russia. Chapter 5. Built in China. The J-10 and the Slow Birth of Independence. The Chengdu J-10 program was launched in February 1984. The requirement was straightforward in concept and nearly impossible in execution. China needed a fourth-generation multi-role fighter it had designed and built entirely on its own. 3 design institutes competed. Chengdu's Delta Canard proposal was selected, a configuration that prioritized agility and whose aerodynamic resemblance to the Israeli IAI Lavi would generate controversy for decades, though both governments consistently denied any connection. Development took 14 years. American spy satellites first photographed J-10 prototypes at the Chengdu facility in 1994 during early flight tests. The Chinese government said nothing. The first successful test flight did not occur until 1998, and it required a Russian-supplied Saturn AL-31FN engine to get off the ground, because China still could not produce a competitive domestic turbofan. The J-10 entered service in 2004. China officially acknowledged its existence in 2007. The J-10C, the most advanced production variant, carries an AESA radar, the Chinese WS-10B engine, and the PL-15 Beyond Visual Range missile. In 2025, Pakistan claimed a J-10C achieved an aerial kill against an Indian Rafale using a PL-15, the first claimed combat kill by any Chinese-designed fighter in history. As of 2025, all J-10 variants combined number approximately 550 aircraft in service. That same productive discipline that eventually delivered the J-10 was applied in parallel to what would become China's most prolifically produced modern fighter. The Shenyang J-16 entered PLAAF service in 2015. Derived from the J-11BS twin-seater and closely related in concept to the Russian Su-30, it was designed as a true multi-role platform. Air superiority, precision strike, anti-ship, and electronic warfare, all from the same airframe. By 2025, approximately 450 J-16S were in service, the fastest production ramp of any Chinese fighter in history. The J-16D, a dedicated electronic warfare variant that first flew in December 2015, replaced the air-to-air missiles with jamming pods and anti-radiation weapons, giving China its first airborne electronic attack platform, the equivalent of the American EA-18G Growler. In 2022, a J-16D intercepted an Australian P-8 maritime patrol aircraft over the South China Sea, releasing a bundle of chaff that was ingested by the P-8's engines, an incident that became a diplomatic flashpoint and a demonstration of the J-16D's operational posture. The JJ-7, the 2-seat supersonic trainer derivative of the J-7 family, deserves a quiet footnote here. The newest JJ-7 was delivered to the PLAAF in 2017. The same year, the J-20 entered service. An aircraft lineage that began with a Soviet MiG-21 copy from the 1950s was still being delivered to Chinese squadrons in the same calendar year as China's first stealth fighter. That overlap says everything about the scale of the transformation the PLAAF was executing. Chapter 6. The Dragon's Teeth. 5th Generation and the Stealth Revolution. On January 11, 2011, a prototype aircraft numbered 2001 lifted off from Chengdu. It flew for approximately 15 minutes. Western intelligence analysts had not expected China to fly a 5th-generation prototype for several more years. The J-20 Mighty Dragon had arrived ahead of schedule, and the assumptions that had governed Western assessments of Chinese aviation capability were revised the same afternoon. The J-20 is a twin-engine Delta Canard stealth fighter with internal weapons bays, an AESA radar, and a low-observable configuration optimized for penetrating contested airspace. Its design borrows visual elements from the American F-22 and the cancelled Russian MiG-1.44. Though Chinese engineers consistently assert the configuration evolved from domestic aerodynamic research. Whether that is entirely accurate matters less than what the aircraft can do. It entered PLAAF service in March 2017. The first combat unit was formed in February 2018, making China the second country in the world and the first in Asia to field an operational stealth fighter. In March 2022, a USAF-E-3 Sentry airborne early warning aircraft failed to detect an approaching J-20 until it was very close, a fact confirmed publicly by the Pacific Air Force's commander, who described the encounter as a genuine concern. In March 2023, Chinese state media confirmed that J-20s were being used to simulate F-35s in opposing force training scenarios, an indication that the PLAAF considered its own aircraft a credible stand-in for the most capable Western fighter in service. From 50 airframes in 2020, J-20 production reached 300 by mid-2025, a five-fold increase in 5 years. The J-20S, a twin-seat variant, began appearing in 2021. It is widely believed to be configured for controlling autonomous wingman drones, a role that places it at the leading edge of a new doctrine of manned-unmanned teaming that no air force has yet fielded at scale. The J-35A completes the picture. China's second fifth-generation fighter, officially unveiled in late 2024 and now believed to be in serial production, is a lighter complement to the J-20, designed to operate alongside it and to equip Chinese aircraft carriers in a naval variant. A single country fielding two simultaneous fifth-generation production lines, one heavy, one light, is something that has not happened outside the United States. Chapter 7. What the numbers say. From 100 aircraft to 1,583. In 1950, the PLAAF had fewer than 100 fighters. In 1954, it had grown to 3,000 aircraft. In the decades that followed, it shrank, stagnated, and modernized in fits and starts, constrained by politics, by the Sino-Soviet split, by the Cultural Revolution, and by an industrial base that consistently promised more than it could deliver on schedule. What changed was pace. Between 2016 and 2022 alone, the PLAAF incorporated over 600 fourth- and fifth-generation aircraft into more than 19 frontline combat brigades. By 2025, China had overtaken Russia in total combat aircraft, 1,583 against 1,522. The J-20 fleet reached 300. The J-16 fleet reached 450. The J-10 fleet reached 550. Those three types alone represent over 1,300 modern combat aircraft, all domestic, all equipped with Chinese engines, Chinese radars, and Chinese missiles. In 2024 and 2025, multiple examples of two different tailless flying wing prototypes were observed at Chinese test facilities, designs that analysts have labeled sixth generation. China is the only country besides the United States with confirmed next-generation manned fighter prototypes actively flying. The PLAAF that went to Korea in 1950 with borrowed Soviet jets and pilots trained in months is gone. What replaced it followed a trajectory that ran through 22 aircraft types across 7 decades, using every method available: licensed copies, reverse engineering, technology acquisition, foreign purchase, and eventually genuine domestic innovation at scale. The J-2 over the Yalu. The J-5 rolling out of Shenyang. The J-8 delayed by a decade of political madness. The flanker purchased out of desperation. The J-10 acknowledged only after it was already flying, and the J-20 delivered ahead of schedule to an air force that had learned, finally, how to build what it needed without asking anyone's permission. That principle did not arrive fully formed. It was forced into existence by decades of embargoes, broken agreements, and cancelled technology transfers. And it is not finished yet.